Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to take up chapter number 1, The Portrait of a Lady. Actually, the title of this chapter, The Portrait of a Lady, is very appropriate. This chapter has been written by Khushwant Singh, Sardar Khushwant Singh, a famous writer. Besides being a pen sketch of his grandmother, the passage is Khushwant Singh's loving tribute to her grandmother, to his grandmother, her relationship with her, and her emotional bond that he shared with her. He graphically describes the person and the personality of the grandmother, her persona, who had all the attributes of a nice lady. So, my dear children, let's start the portrait of a lady. Let's start reading. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. Means my bond with her was of 20 years. Since my birth to the age of 20, I was with her. People said that she had once been young. She had once been young. How could be? How could that be? How could I know it? And had a husband also. But that was hard to believe. Why it was hard to believe? Because ever since I had seen my grandmother, she was old. That wrinkled face, old, you can say lady. My grandfather, my grandfather's portrait, my grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece. What is mantelpiece here? Actually, it is a shelf above a fireplace. Fireplace, you must have seen this in movie, this fireplace, and just above it, this portrait of my grandfather was hung. He wore a big turban, as you are seeing, on his head, and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. Appears to be, right? You must be seeing the photograph. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. Now, somewhere the narrator, on looking at the photograph, could never imagine that this fellow had ever a wife or children. Why? Because he looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. It is there, right? He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. What do you mean by revolting here? Revolting here stands for it was very hard to accept for me that she once had been pretty, beautiful. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. Now, how can one believe that a grand old lady of over 80 years could play such a game? That was beyond the imagination of the narrator. That seemed quite absurd to me. Absurd and undignified. Absurd means absolutely illogical. How could my granny play such a game on her part? And we treated it like fables. The fables means some stories, short stories of olden times, right? Fables of the prophets. Prophet means the messengers of God. The stories that we hear about the messengers of God, it really suited her. But playing like a child could never be imagined. Actually, she used to tell us about her life stories. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles. As you must be seeing here, her face was completely wrinkled and frowning, right? Wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere on her face. No, we were certain that she had always been as as we had known her. How old one only. So terribly old that she could not have grown older. Means she has reached the last stage of old age even, and stayed at the same age for 20 years. For the last 20 years since I had been seeing her, she was old. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white. Always hobbled like in a spotless white. Hobble means to move with all difficulties. To move with all difficulties by putting just like this. By putting her hand, her silver locks, sorry, just one line is there. Hobbled about the house in spotless white, one hand resting on her waist. Now you can see her left hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop. Stoop means the bent of her back. And other telling the beads of her rosary. In one hand she had rosary beads always. Right? Rosary, you can say small knitted beads are knitted into a thread, and generally people keep them with just to say prayers. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face. Puckered face here stand for what? Puckered means wrinkled face. Absolutely, you can say somewhere withered. Face was withered, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Continuously, she said her prayers. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains. Winter landscape in the mountains, just white as the snow is there, as the snowy mountains appear. An expanse of pure white serenity. Serenity stands for calmness. Complete calm lady that moved about in the house, moved around in the house. Silver locks, some curled and white hair, gray hair near the forehead. They were scattered over there, scattered over her face. Right? She always busy in moving her lips in some inaudible which cannot be heard, those prayers. Right? She was breathing peace and contentment, quite satisfied with her life. My grandmother, let's come here. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. Good friends. Generally, what happens? Children often become good friends of their grandparents, and that was what with me. Right? So she was a good friend of mine. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song. Monotonous stand for you can say unchanging and boring way. The tone of her voice was completely you can say not interesting. At least not interesting to me. That was there. Sing song. She bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. Her wish was, what was her wish? That she would continue singing and I should listen so that I can remember it. I can memorize it. Then she would fetch me a wooden slate. Do you know what a wooden slate is like? It is just like this. A wooden slate. Earlier, students used to use it. A wooden slate which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk. Yellow chalk, you know, I'll call it in Hindi, multani mitti, है ना? And a tiny earthen ink pot. This was the sort of ink pot that I used to carry with me. Ink pot and red pen, and tie them in a bundle and hand it to me. After a breakfast of thick, stale, old chapatis. Stale chapati means old chapatis. This is the chapati. Stale old chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it. We went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs also. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. Temple here stands for Gurudwara, right? The priest taught us the alphabet. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda. On both the sides of veranda, children used to sit and singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. Chorus stands for in a group. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. My grandmother entered the temple and she used to read the holy scriptures. When we both had finished, means my school was over, her prayer was over, then we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. Village dogs were there. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other. For what? For the chapatis we threw to them. Means they enjoyed every way. Even dogs, they had made a habit that they would receive chapatis from my grandmother, and that was our routine. That was our daily routine. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Means somewhere the friendship between grandson and grandmother that brought about a big change. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. Why? Why could she not come to school with me? Because I used to go in an English school, in motor bus, in the school bus, you can say. Earlier, grandmother used to leave me there at the school, used to drop me at the school, but now I used to go in school bus. There were no dogs in the street, and she took to feeding sparrows only. She took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard in our city house. Right? So, my dear, that marks the end of this particular segment, and we shall continue with the next part of this video. Please continue reading the chapter.